Well, I'm glad you're well, Ron. So we last left off in this amazing text from the beginning of the Zohar's commentary on Parshat Breshit. You recall, right? This was in this PDF, right, of the map, the one you had to turn around or print out and turn around. Well, this is the creation of Elohim, and maybe somebody wants to give us a little bit of a recap of what you took away from that text so far before we pick up with the last fourth of it or so. We've been talking about the relationship between mysticism and poetry, how this is a kind of poetic discourse, but it's also it's a kind of poetry that is also deeply theological, deeply mythic, and as Ron had mentioned last time, right? It has powerful echoes, you might say, of an image like the Big Bang or something of that order. That there's a kind of explosion of divine reality. So who'd like to lead us with a little bit of chazara, as they say, a little right? Not to read it again, but maybe just a few elements that you took away from that first part, really through the Daniel quote, right? Of course, it's it's very straightforward stuff. Of course, right? No, nothing to see here, right? What was sure. What was striking to you? What are some of your takeaways? Leah, I think I saw you raising your hand, right? Please take it away.
So, a lot of emphasis here, a lot of talk about color. A little bit confusing to know, probably on purpose,
Right.
what we're supposed to take away from it. But first we have a lot about, I was waiting for your mom to say this, about light, but she didn't say it. So spark and all the radiant colors, spark, gush to flow, imbuing colors. So we don't know, I guess, whether the colors are to be taken literally, or they're a way for us to kind of get a sense of the variety of light manifestations.
That last.
Also,
sorry, keep going, Lee. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I remembered also we talked about the fact that there are things that appear to be contradictory, like the flow broke through and did not break through its aura, and then until under the impact of breakthrough. So there are things happening, and then what appears to be the opposite of those things. So more than our senses can normally take in.
Yes. I think that last point and the point before really do get to the heart of it, right? Because as we mentioned last time, there is a kind of what scholars of religion call a kind of speaking away, right, or technically apophasis, right? This kind of, you say it and you unsay it immediately, right? So that in the paradox, there lies a mystification, or perhaps it's a way of saying you can't quite capture this in language, right? It's to say it is and it isn't at the same time, right? It's kind of which is both to undo the nature of the assertion on the one hand, right, to say that we can experience a dimension of the divine, because this is ultimately about the revelation of the hidden God. But we also are fundamentally unable to know, right? And it pushes the boundaries of that very language. It's meant to stun us into this characteristic of ineffability, right? That I can't quite put it into language, and yet the poetic impulse, the lyric impulse of the mystic poet here, if you will, is precisely to put it into language, right? So on the one hand, the mystic poet is driven to put this into lyrical and imagistic language, right? To evoke it in all of this panoply of color and imagery and rhythm and music and so forth. And at the same time, to undo that to a certain extent, to stun us into paradox, as though to say that language as an extension of knowledge, right? If we say that language is a kind of realization of knowledge, right? And generally in the Hebrew versions of this, you say machshava, kol, v'dibur. Machshava, thought, kol, voice or sound, and dibur, ordered language, and that there's a kind of a flow from those. So therefore, language, or the ability to speak it out, to articulate it, is directly related to the ability to know. Right? So if I can't quite put it into words, that becomes a statement about the ultimate inability to truly know. And in that sense, it's powerfully about divine. It's both about radical divine transcendence, right? This is kind of beyond the scope of the ability of the human mind to know and experience God, and yet there is this highly sensory, highly experiential, even contemplative portrait here, right? Of the emergence of an attempt to paint a kind of verbal canvas, right, of color that is not color at the same time, right? And just to place this into the context of Kabbalistic theology, in other words, what's really going on here for these thinkers as Kabbalistic theologians, it's essentially to say that really all of reality, all of being, is pure infinity. We mentioned this a little bit last time, I think. And but the human mind, is in its finitude, in its limitation, in its mortality, is unable to grasp that infinity. And so therefore there's this, in this desire to be known, there is this beginning of the engravings, the beginning of the emergence of this first point of light, right? One high and hidden point shown, and the recurrent refrain of light and illumination, as you mentioned, Lee, right, and as was a theme also in our first text that we looked at, in the soliloquy to the Muse of Torah, is a deep structural motif in some ways, right? A deep theme that structures Jewish mysticism more broadly, and mysticisms of other religions as well, right? That God is understood to be this stunning being of light that that often eludes the ability of the human mind to grasp, and that the devotee, the practitioner, the person who seeks to encounter God, ultimately, in that moment of encounter, becomes illuminated as well, right? Becomes enlightened as well. And so this language of light, of illumination, of darkness and of color, of hiddenness and revelation, permeates all of this. Ultimately culminating in this citation of the verse from the book of Daniel, speaking about, as the Zohar interprets the line, speaking about Kabbalists, speaking about mystics, ones who experience, they shine like the Zohar of the sky or of the firmament, because they contemplate the light that is divinity. This, as I mentioned last time, this at the end of the first long stanza, if you will, is so it is called beginning, right? Because this is ultimately a commentary on Bereshit, as ultimately to say that is what Reshit is. Reshit being beginning, Bereshit, in the beginning, which also is also carries the resonance of older midrashic interpretations about the meaning of Reshit as right, it means beginning, but it's also divine wisdom. It's also chokhmah, in part because of correlations between that the rabbis made between Genesis and Proverbs, right, where it says that where Lady Wisdom says that God created me at the beginning of God's way. Adonai Kanani Reshit Darko in Mishlei Chet, right? And so Chokhmah, wisdom, which is the second of the divine emanations, is understood to be this first point of where knowledge is possible. Right? I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of trying to explain the whole intricacies of the Sefirot and so forth, right? Because that, I think that will take us a little bit too far afield. But suffice it to say that the higher dimensions of God are understood to be radically concealed, and the first dimension that allows the human mind to contemplate God in some way is this thing called wisdom, this thing called chokhmah, this thing that is also called reshit, because it is the first point of light that emerges from the ultimate mystery of darkness, that emerges as the first glint in the human mind. Okay. And believe it or not, it actually gets even better. But before we find out how it gets even better, I see there is a question or a thought. Please take it away.
So can you enlighten us about the first sentence, the first line,
Oh, yeah.
when the king conceived ordaining?
So there are a number of different translations of this. In the Aramaic, it's Beresh Hormanuta de Malka. So it's actually kind of a bit of poetic license is being taken here, right? Literally, it's actually at the beginning of the will of the will of the king, right? Or the beginning of the desire of Ein Sof, of the endless nature of God that is unknowable, to make God's self knowable. God engraved this infinity, engraved engravings in this pure ether on high, right? Itself a kind of paradox. Instead of speaking, there's a kind of engraving language.
There's a desire from the beginning of God or the king to be known, or sort of be known, or be known and not known.
So to a certain extent, this this goes back to the idea that was already developed among some philosophers, that there was that something was created from nothing, right? That yesh me'ayin was created. So in order to preserve this nothingness is understood to be this radical mysteriousness of infinity, and that there was a will, a ratzon, or in the Zohar's terminology, a rava, that emerged within that infinity to create. This was traced back by some scholars to Shlomo ibn Gabirol's philosophy and poetry, that there was a kind of will to create that erupted in the purity of oneness. But let's press on a little bit, just to see how this text wraps itself together, and then we'll try to continue to clarify some of these discrepancies. So maybe we could have a volunteer to read for us at the bottom of this page of 49, where it says Zohar, concealed of the concealed. And just to begin, right? It says, you'll see there are at least two places here where it says and then such and such, right? Zohar, such and such, and it's been argued by some scholars, in particular the Israeli scholar Yehuda Libes, that this idea of the use of Zohar is kind of like it's almost like a spiritual awakening, right? It's like Zohar, awaken to the light, and I will tell you, and then Zohar, awaken. But you can also see this as a kind of in the way that I'm reading this, also as a kind of rhythm of poetry as well, right? Or how the function of not just repetition, but how there are certain words that function to awaken a certain experience in the reader. But let's read this aloud. Perhaps we can have a volunteer who is feeling the Zohar, concealed of the concealed. Ron is feeling it.
Zohar, concealed of the concealed, struck its aura. The aura touched, it did not touch this point. Then this beginning emanated and made itself a palace for its glory and its praise. There it sowed the seed of holiness to give birth for the benefit of the universe. The secret is, quote, her stock is a holy seed, from Isaiah.
So let's pause there for a moment, just in case that sounded a little enigmatic to you, which it was meant to, right? Again, this part of the nature of this mystic poetry, if we can call it that, which I suggest we can, is that it is meant to mystify. It is meant to actually to generate an experience of mystification in the reader, and thereby produce a kind of mystical, spiritual, contemplative experience.
Well, right? It is, after all, the concealed of the concealed.
And it is the concealed of the concealed, right? The satima de satimin in Aramaic. So how did this happen, right? That there's this ultimate state of concealment, and then from this thing called beginning, reshit, emanated, right? Like flowed forth, like a river of light. I just added that, right? And this beginning emanated. So if we're putting this in the terms of the sfirot of Kabbalistic theology, that God is made up of 10 flowing dimensions called sefirot, sephirah in the singular, sefirot in the plural, right? Perhaps related to a variety of possibilities, but whether it's the counting of 10, it's also quite possibly related to the word sapphire, sapphire. It's not entirely clear. But this word goes back already hundreds of years and is part of the grounding of Kabbalistic interpretation. But the word sphira is not used in the Zohar directly, which is part of its attempt to project itself back onto Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his disciples. We talked about in the first session, right? That the Zohar is what's called a pseudepigraphical work, right? It attributes its authorship back to antiquity for the sake of you might say passing itself off as ancient, though that sounds pejorative. There are all kinds of reasons why that's done, right? And they may have believed there were reincarnations of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But at the very least, this is it's a medieval work, and there's a whole series of reasons for that, which would take us too far afield to get into in terms of how that was determined. But this was projected back into antiquity but the idea here being, right, just as we saw that first point that emerges out of infinity is this thing called beginning, Reshit, because this is all a commentary on the word Bereshit, right? What does Bereshit mean, right? And ultimately, where the text is going with this is that it's through this thing called Reshit, which is one of the 10 mentions within the one God, and the Kabbalists will tell you over and over again, the 10 are one, the one is 10, and so on and so forth. And if that sounds like the 3 are one, and the one is 3, that's is actually a very interesting comparison. But that's for another. That's another conversation to have. But the point is that for the Kabbalists, God is a complete and utter oneness, and that is the bedrock principle of this theology, but it's nevertheless made up of 10 dimensions of emanation, which is compared in a number of different cases to, right, the 10 fingers of the hands, right? They seem separate, but they are part of the one body, right? Or your different parts of the human body, but they're all part of the oneness of that identity. So these are some of the ways in which it's talked about. Or you might have many different rivers and streams, and so I mentioned this in the first session, but they're all part of the oneness of all water in the world, right? That it's all water is ultimately interconnected. So it just seems to be separate, is what they would say. But really, and that seemingness is actually significant because it kind of it opens up different dimensions of understanding God. But the deep truth is that behind that seeming manifoldness is a complete oneness. But the question is, what does the word Bereshit mean? So right, literally, of course, it means in the beginning, but already in older midrashim, this word was taken apart to mean that it was Bereshit. Through this thing called Reshit, God created the world. Okay, so that's already in non-mystical texts, and there are all kinds of speculations. Well, what does Reshit mean? One of the answers that's given actually is that it's through Torah that God created the world. Torah pre-exists the world according to already ancient non-mystical literature, and that it was through Torah that God created the world. And what is the essence of Torah? Of course, it's wisdom. What is wisdom but Torah? So it makes sense in their minds that this would be Chokhmah, right? So it's through this dimension called wisdom, which is also Reshit, which is also Torah, which is also many other things. But it's through this primordial dimension that the rest of the emanation came to be. Now, this is significant that I say it this way, because that's where he's going with this interpretation of the first verse of Genesis in this lyrical, mystifying way, is essentially to reread the verse in a radically playful way, but building on those older midrashic foundations. So here it's then this beginning, this Reshit, which is also Chokhmah, also wisdom, emanated and made itself a palace for its glory and praise. So that's really the third dimension of the 10, right? That's called, not directly here, but it's called Bina, understanding, or it's called the heavenly palace, or in this case, it's also like the womb of all being, from which, right? Because there's a kind of there is a feminine dimension to this aspect of God that births all of reality. So there's an emanation into that palace where it sowed the seed of holiness, which essentially is it essentially impregnated this feminine dimension within God called the palace, and sowed the seed of holiness to give birth for the benefit of the universe, or really to give birth to the universe, right? So there's this kind of primordial moment of eros at the end of a kind of inner divine mythic sexuality, where the male seeds the future world into the primordial womb of being. All of this is taking place within God, right? Just to give you a radically different theology to sink your teeth into. But it's happening. It's almost as though it's flowing out of itself, right? And that's what's significant here, is that this energy is flowing out of God's self, ultimately spreading out, just like that first hiddenness spread out into the many colors of reality. And this becomes actually even clearer to the extent to which it's clear in the next stanza, right? Now again, Zohar, awaken to this light again. Who'd like to take it from, who'd like to take the baton?
The Isaiah quote,
What's the significance of the Isaiah quote you're saying?
what it even means, or I don't know, I don't even understand her stock. What is stock? What type of stock?
Her stock is a holy seed. It's essentially to say that her offspring, the offspring of this palace are holy seed, meaning that ultimately it's a right in its context, it's a reference to the people of Israel, but it's actually that it's like the seed of life is planted in order to unfold through the universe. Zohar, sowing a seed for its glory, like the seed of fine purple silk. The silkworm wraps itself within and makes itself a palace. This palace is its praise and the benefit to all. So this is significant because the silk is produced right out of the silkworm itself. Right, so out of this entity called the silkworm, the silk, which represents this flowing of energy, emerges and flows and ultimately creates this state of energy and beauty. Right, so this is essentially speaking about this birthing of the universe from the most hidden point of divine infinity, which is also the God coming into greater revealment, right? Revelation, where the human being can somehow know something about God. With the beginning, Bereshit, right? So now is the kind of playful rereading of the first verse of Genesis. Imagine this as Bereshit blank, meaning the concealed one, created, right? With beginning blank, created Elohim, right? Bereshit blank bara Elohim, because Elohim here is the palace, is this third dimension of divine reality called Bina. So instead of it saying that in the beginning God created heaven and earth, it's saying through this thing called Reshit, the hiddenmost dimension of God emanated the next level of divinity, and therefore the rest of the universe came to unfold from it. So it becomes this radical rereading of the first verse of Genesis. Through this thing called Reshit, through this dimension called Chokhmah, called wisdom, the infinite one emanated the rest of reality, right? Is essentially how we can strip it down, right? Through point of wisdom, the transcendent infinity gave birth to everything else, right? So it's a total transformation of what we think the story of Genesis is about, right? Instead of it being about the creation of this lower world, it's actually all about the genesis of reality as it emerges from God's self, and God moving from a state of radical hiddenness to a gradual state of revelation, spinning the universe like silk from God's own self, right? So it's as though to say that all of reality is like this illuminated silk that flows forth from the very self of divine infinity. And so therefore infinity births this silky luminosity of reality. And that is the deep mystery of creation, and also fundamentally says that actually where you thought there was division, where you thought there was separateness, there really is just all God. Because God spins the silk of reality from God's very self, and that reality is that we experience ultimately is the web of silk.
This sounds almost polytheistic. We have the concealed one and we have Elohim.
Right. So this is it's absolutely playing on the edges of quite boldly on the edges of a mythology of multiple powers within God, right? And it is dancing on the edges of the polytheistic, right? But what the Kabbalists would say is that in order to truly understand this, we need to realize that all of these dimensions that we call by different names, that we think of as different elements of reality, that we call Elohim, that we call the concealed one, these are different dimensions of the one God, right?
But then that sounds like Christianity. The Father, the Son, and the Ghost.
Right. So that was the comparison that I made. Right. Is that
Oh, sorry, I missed last week.
is that no, even just now is that the it's not untrue to say that Christian theories of the Trinity, right, are not is not a theory in which the three are separate, but really the three are one, right? So it's essentially talking about many different dimensions that exist within the one God. That's not to say that it is Christianity. It's just similar, right? Just like there are similarities between different religions, right? So in other words, but you're absolutely right in the sense that it's very much flirting with the borders of that whole question. You're picking up on that absolutely, right? Because it's almost as though it's teasing us in that way, right? To talk about these multiple dimensions, but really the deepest truth is that it's all one. It's all one. And this becomes, this is really the kind of the great refrain of the Zohar is kula chad. Everything is one. Whether you could say that that's a certain amount of defensiveness or apologetics for the very fact of talking about the 10, and I think that there's a dimension of that, but it's also, I think that they perceived that their theology was that reality as we encounter it, right? Let's even take this apart from just these different dimensions of God, right? If all of reality, right, is this silk of divinity, including you and I and everything that is, everything is the infinity of divinity, and all separateness is but a seeming, is but an illusion, is but a construct of the mind. And if that sounds like Buddhism, that's true too, right? But what that fundamentally means is that I encounter the world as fragmented. I encounter the world as manifold, as made up of all of these different elements of reality. But when I cultivate a mystic consciousness, when I'm able to see the world through the eyes of true, as they would say, deep mystical sight, I'm able to realize that everything is shot through, everything is run through with this undivided light of God, this undivided silk of divinity, this undivided water that seems like separate streams, but really is all the one unified water of reality. So this is a difficult text, right? This and a very, very dense text. So it's a challenging one to work through, and the reason why it's nevertheless very valuable is that it's actually a very rich example of the poetry of theological myth in the Zohar, right? Of the way and of the way in which the reality of a new conception of God is presented, right? That God is the great oneness that is endless, but manifests in these different ways, and awaken and enlighten your mind to the luminosity of that truth. It's also a way of saying you thought you understood what Genesis 1:1 was all about, and now I'm going to tell you it doesn't mean that at all. It actually means something entirely different in its deepest sense, right? Because that's also part of the mystical assertion that where I thought I understood the truth of Torah, I actually come to realize that there are deep secrets of God contained therein. And I think let's actually turn now to a less abstruse text for our concluding bit of time. One that this is the hidden light text, but not on page 51, but on page 52 is where we're going to pick up with. Right, where it says Exodus 34:30 at the top, right? Or Kasalma, he wrapped himself in it in light as a garment, and let there be light, as a way of showing how the Zohar uses a classic image of the hidden light, right? Because there was already a classic notion that you find in Masechet Chagiga. That when God first created the world, God created a light that went through which one could see misofa olam ba'ad sofo, from the earth to the other. But God had second thoughts, if you will, and became afraid that the wicked of the world would abuse this light, and so God decided to hide this light in the Torah for the tzaddikim la'atid lavo, for the righteous in the world to come. And the Zohar doesn't change that fundamental myth terribly dramatically, but it actually gives us ultimately a nice kavanah for studying Torah together. So it's actually it'll actually I think bring us to a good place. Okay, so if we could have a volunteer who will read for us with starting with "Let there be light, and there was light."
I could volunteer.
Great.
Let there be light, and there was light. Every subject of the phrase "and there was" exists in this world and in the world that is coming. Rabbi Yitzchak said, "The light created by the Blessed Holy One in the act of creation flared from one end of the world to the other and was hidden away. Why was it hidden away? So that the wicked of the world would not enjoy it, and the worlds would not enjoy it because of them. It is stored away for the righteous one, as it is written, light is sown for the righteous one, joy for the upright in heart. Then the worlds will be fragrant and all will be one. But until the day when the world that is coming arrives, it is stored and hidden away."
So before we get to what Rabbi Yehuda says, right? So this is a recapitulation of an older midrash, but it's also playing with a couple of other dimensions. The righteous one. I'm not going to really get into that right now, but it's what is the tzaddik, the tzaddikim. But the idea is that there was this primordial light of Vayehi Or that was hidden away to ultimately be revealed, right? So again, we're coming back to this leitmotif of light. Okay. But Rabbi Yehuda said, right? So it was hidden away, and in the future times, then the worlds will be fragrant. That's a common image that we see in the Zohar, and all will be one. But until that day that is coming arrives, is stored and is hidden away. But then Rabbi Yehuda says,
if it were completely hidden, the world would not exist for even a moment. Rather, it is hidden and sown like a seed that gives birth to seeds and fruit. Thereby the world is sustained.
So
Every
let's just
single
pause. So let's pause it for one second. So that already is something very different that the Zohar has added, right? Which is to say that if it were completely hidden, if that first light of creation were completely hidden, the world would not be able to exist even for a moment. It's that light of divinity that actually sustains all of reality, but it is hidden and sown like a seed, made like beneath the soil, if you will, of reality, right? It's hidden beneath the soil of reality, sown like a seed that then gives birth to seeds and fruit, and thereby the world is sustained. So the world is sustained by that primordial, right? That first light of olden times, that spiritual light that came forth from God. And how is that does that sustenance take place? Remember that we talked about that I mentioned before, right? I don't think it's actually entirely mentioned here, but in the midrashic context, right? Where is it hidden away? It's hidden away in the Torah, right? Where does a nice Jewish God hide primordial light? But in the Torah, right? But there again, this image that Torah pre-existed creation. So it's not Torah that we take out of the Ark in the Shul. It's not the Torah of Torah Shabbal Peh, but it's a kind of spiritual essence of Torah. Okay. So now to the culmination. So thereby the world is sustained every single day.
Every single day, a ray of that light shines into the world and keeps everything alive. For with that ray, the Blessed Holy One feeds the world, and everywhere that Torah is studied at night, one thread-thin ray appears from that hidden light and flows down upon those absorbed in her, as it is written, "By day God will enjoin his love, in the night his song is with me," as we have already established. Since the first day, it has never been fully revealed, but it plays a vital role in the world, renewing every day the act of creation.
So that light continues to, right? Hamachadesh b'chol yom tamid maseh breshit, right? That world, that creation is renewed by God through that light each and every day. How? Through the study of Torah, because by the study of Torah, that light of the Torah of old, right? That essence, spiritual essence of Torah, a little bit of a ray of light is released. It keeps everything alive. And very evocatively, especially for us, right? Studying Torah at night, which was actually a significant practice for the Kabbalists, was to study mystical meanings of the Torah late at night, oftentimes at midnight. It was understood to be particularly propitious, particularly good time to study because of Shat HaChesed, because of divine, a time of divine grace, love, forgiveness, and so forth. Everywhere that the Torah is studied at night. So see if you can feel it, because we're studying Torah at night. One thread thin ray appears from that hidden light and flows down upon those absorbed in her, right? And I know you can feel it now. Flows down upon those absorbed in her, right? Renewing each day the work of creation. So this is, I think, an interesting kind of place to get to, because it's both, I think, poetically evocative, albeit in a far less mind-bending way than our other texts, right? But also says something about the spiritual practice of Torah study that re-accesses that first light that was hidden in the Torah at the beginning of time, right? And not only that, but that beginning of creation that was Vayehi Or is reenacted again and again. Hamachadesh b'chol yom tamid maaseh Bereshit, through the act of Torah study. We are activating a little bit of that light that nourishes the world and recreates it, if you will, right? That gives it its sustenance. And so this, like the other text, right, is it's not just about abstract mystical theology, although it's that too. It's fundamentally experiential. It's fundamentally about, right, the contemplative experience, the spiritual experience of Torah study in this case, or in the other case, the spiritual experience of contemplating the mysteries and the wonderment and the stunning nature of divine mystery, all of which is meant to take us, in the first case, to a place in mind beyond mind, right? Or a state of awareness beyond the ability to know in ordinary ways, right? We're kind of, it's like it's similar to poetry, I suggest, right? Especially the first text that's so dense, precisely because it's meant to push us beyond our ordinary understanding of how the mind works and of how we know things, right? This is less about rational, reasoned knowledge, in the same way that often if you read certain types of poetry, right? It's not meant to read like prose. It's meant to kind of stir a certain musical awakening in you, right? It's meant to stir a kind of emotional state in you. It's meant to move your soul in some way that you can't quite name. And here, the experiential dimension is that by studying Torah, which we are doing together at night, maybe even late at night, depending on your definition, right? Is even if we're not doing it at chatzot like they did at midnight, then we're feeling that thread thin, that ray of divine light from olden times shining on us and recreating the world. Yes, Dr. Fishbane.
So Dr. Fishbane. So here's the deal.
Doctor?
As I read this, I'm really taken by God's ambivalence or tension between, on the one hand, it seems like in this text, God is in a effulgent way just giving the light, and letting Adam see the whole thing. And then when he realizes there's going to be these wicked generations, he realizes this is a little, this can't be. So he has to hide it. And that seems to be repeated throughout, and yet, if it was completely hidden, we couldn't exist. But we can't have it completely open because there's wickedness. So there's that, and maybe also because we would be blown away by it. That's a whole other possibility. Yeah. But this tension between you need the light, but too much isn't good, and that leads us to Tzimtzum, I guess, although it's not stated here. The whole notion.
Right. That particular concept is really developed a few hundred years later in Kabbalah, but it exists to a certain extent in some of the earlier literature. But that dialectic that you're talking about is very true, right? It's on the one hand it has to be hidden, and on the other hand, a little bit of the light has to come out. Just like, right? It's this unfold, just like we see in the other text, right? So there's and let's go back to our original, our first text that we looked at, right, where Rabbi Shimon is agonizing over the process of revelation, right? Woe if I reveal, woe if I don't reveal it, right? I need to reveal a little bit of this light because the companions in the world needs it, the light of Torah, but I also have to keep it secret because it's so precious, and because it can be abused, because it can be dangerous, because it could lead people to think that I'm talking about polytheism, perhaps, right? That actually was, I think, one of their fears and why they tried to keep it very guarded, right? That and the fact that there's an enormous amount of sexuality and eros in it. But I think that this tension between the drive to reveal and to let the light nourish and to let the light flow, and that same kind of haunting feeling that they had, that they have to somehow conceal it, they have to somehow keep it hidden. But I think a good kavanah for us, and a good even a good bracha for us is that in these evenings of gathering together and studying Torah together, that like Rabbi Yehuda says, you have hopefully and we have all hopefully begun to feel a little bit of that flow of divine light that is constantly sustaining and constantly recreating the world and recreating ourselves and our imaginations and our spiritual lives. So with that, I wish all of you and all of us many blessings, lots of good health, and continued sustenance from the rays of light of Torah that began at the beginning of time and continue to this very moment.
Thank you.
Thank
For
you.
teaching us.
Yes.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
That was very good.
Lovely learning with all of you.
Yeah, this was terrific.
Yes.
Ron, did you want to say something?
Well, it's kind of a light thing, but if you like the Big Bang analogy or similarity, I had like two more physics ones that came to my mind as you're talking.
The science.
I mean, the one is that the different like 10 dimensions of God is very similar to string theory,
Oh, wow.
Wow.
where you also have like 10 dimensions. I don't know exactly how many.
Yeah, it used to be 10. They upped it to 11.
Yeah, so, okay. But you have that type of
10
order.
plus what? 10 plus 1, right? 1 for the whole. So
But they all come together to make one, of course. So it's kind of similar. And then this last line of it, like not being fully revealed, or let's say the Big Bang was not, or the creation is not fully revealed at the point of creation. I mean, it's the same, the Big Bang idea, there was so much information lost that we can't kind of gather because of with so much energy or it's happened so quickly. So it's also very similar that or you can say the uncertainty principle. Once we know, we lose information that's there.
And matter and form and so forth, right? And the
Right.
unity and the unity of all things.
There's a lot there that we lost out on. We only have a remnant of it,
Right.
and so it's also kind of all kind of supernatural.
There, for those of you who are interested in that correlation, which is actually, I think, is a really fascinating one. Actually, Daniel Matt, who translated this particular text, wrote a rather accessible work called God and the Big Bang, which essentially is finding harmony between science and spirituality. And he's a very serious scholar of Kabbalah, and so he's reflecting on a number of these kinds of correlations. So it's interesting, an interesting work designed for a general audience that you might find interesting. So with that, may we all be zoche to the light and to remnants of the Big Bang too.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe say the next MiniU, I think, is going to be, I was looking at my notes, I think it's going to start November 15th with Zach Wayner, who's was working on kind of early, more Sumerian Israelite type of time period. So we'll go back in time period, and he, I think he's moved on a little bit, but he got his PhD and was teaching for a while on these topics. So like how the early Israelites were formed and going back to periods.
November 17th.
I think November 15th. It's going to be on Sundays, Sunday
Oh,
evening.
that's what I was asking. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sunday evenings.
I hope we can see you there again also. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Eitan. That was great.
Thank you,
Well,
Eitan. Thank you for your
Great to
thinking.
learn with all of you. Be well.
Really
We
great.
really need the light these days.
Amen.
Exactly.
Okay. And here.